Hello and welcome to Gym with Gwynne. I'm Oliver Gwynne, and this is where we talk about marketing, data, and philosophy. This week is unusual. It's a second part. That's right. We left on a cliffhanger last week where I was talking about KPIs and how we should pursue behaviors over KPIs, and that often we don't control the outcomes. And this week I'm talking very much about processes and how they ladder up to behaviors. So go back if you didn't watch last week, because maybe this will make more sense in context to that one. Process mapping is what I'm going to be focusing on today, and process improvement. It's a really big subject, so I'm not going to be able to cover everything in this week. I'm sorry. I'm just going to cover some of the basic fundamentals of that, and then we're going to move on to how data informs processes. Probably next week, maybe we can have a three-parter, guys. How exciting for you, maybe. I don't know if the audience is following along. It's difficult. It's very, very difficult, process mapping. And the reason is, one, a lot of processes involve stakeholder interviews, SME interviews. It involves sitting and watching somebody do a particular process. It involves maybe screen capture. And what comes with that is basically you're saying to somebody, hey, how do you do something? Let me watch you do it. And of course, that makes people very nervous just in general, because it's odd to have somebody over your shoulder watching you do something. You're more likely to make mistakes, or you're more likely to be like, oh my God, why is this person watching me do something? Is it because my job is on the line? Am I going to be replaced if I suddenly start giving away how I do a particular thing? It makes people really worried. It's also something that is relatively time consuming to map out, and it's not part of people's core job. So it's a little bit of a distraction. It gets in the way of business as usual. And so you have to just bear in mind that process mapping is painful. Think about that before you go on this exercise, and make sure that when you're mapping out processes, that there's a really good use case from it, which is that you want to improve those processes. Don't just map every process for the sake of it. Now, obviously, processes are useful for when you're hiring new people, for when you're looking to improve these things, and when you want to grow as a company, you kind of need those things in place. But make sure that you are communicating that first and foremost, and it's not about replacing people's jobs, because it does make them worry. Where do we start with processes in terms of what questions do we ask? What are we looking for? Last week, I was talking about sales and how sales behaviors should be optimized over sales outcomes. Let's stick with that example. So let's just say, for example, you are looking to cold convert people from LinkedIn. That's the thing you're looking to improve. Number one thing to think about when you're interviewing and mapping out this process is, what are the variables in play that you can control? So with sales processes, it might be who are you targeting? That's one. Frequency of how often are you messaging somebody? The messages themselves, of course, and then the sequence, the order that you message them. Those are the things that you can control. Only 4 things, but obviously there's a lot of room to play inside of those things. There's a lot of variation within there. There's a lot of optimization that can take place. So with any process, first of all, think about what are the variables at play that you can control, because those are the things that you want to map out in your process, and those are the things that you want to potentially automate or improve. The second thing is, when you start mapping out the real world is a messy old thing, very difficult to account for every possibility and every single outcome. And so it's really important that while you should definitely be noting down these edge cases and these different variations and different variables, very important, start with the most common things, the things that happen 90% of the time. Have in mind those 10%, because they're very useful, and you should not forget about them or just push them to one side, but start with the most common things. Because edge cases, typically you can deal with them if you've got half a brain cell and you're reacting and you're thinking about what to do, or you can go and ask somebody, how do I deal with this particular use case? But where an edge case happens more and more frequently, obviously you probably need a policy behind that. You need a process at a certain point where it becomes more and more frequent. And that can happen for a variety of reasons. Let's just say the pandemic happens and suddenly people are asking, hey, Should I be coming into work and you work in HR, and what's your process that you're trying to optimize? Well, as soon as you start to see more and more people ask that thing, you need a policy in place, you need a process behind that. So edge cases are important to know, but when I'm starting to think about improving something, deal with the things that happen more and more of the time, because you will go slightly insane trying to map out every single outcome and optimize for that. And you will have a really complicated process that people will not follow. And the most important thing with any process, if you want people to follow it, keep it simple. The next thing to consider is behaviors, signals, and philosophy. So let's just say your philosophy is you don't want to send somebody messages if they're not interested. You don't want to waste your time doing that. You're sending one message a quarter. And you might say, if somebody's had 4 messages and they've not read them, they're not interested. Makes sense, right? Or does it? You are conflating signals with behavior. Very, very dangerous thing to do. Because what if somebody has a setting where they've read your message, but it doesn't show? A lot of people have that setting on LinkedIn. So you're conflating one thing with another. What if they are the target person, the perfect person, and they'd be really interested, but LinkedIn is not the right channel? This is the difficulty when we stop and think about processes and we start to think about signals and what we assume happens, because assumptions are very, very dangerous. And that's why we should build our processes to reduce these assumptions. Now, assumptions are healthy, they're useful, they're a way of shortening your time and all of that kind of stuff, but always build in a process to make sure that you are reducing uncertainty wherever possible. So coming back to our red thing, you could say somebody hasn't responded, they're not interested. That makes a lot of sense to most of us. But before you say they're not interested, why don't you try and email them? Why don't you try and call them? And when you've gone through that certainty that you've been able to message them without hopefully being a nuisance, because you've only messaged them 4 times in a year, you've done 1 email maybe, and you've done 1 call, that's reasonable, I think, to most people. And if they said no to you, of course, you've got rid of them. You can say, okay, this person is not interested. Either I just put them on LinkedIn and they can see my updates, and maybe one day they'll be interested. Maybe I then only message them once a year. Or you just say, you know what, this person isn't active, let's just get rid of them. Get rid of them completely. Why waste my time? But be very careful when you conflate certain signals to certain behaviors, because there is nothing as changeable as human behaviors. We all act very differently to different situations, and never, ever forget about that. When you're mapping all these things out, I always think a flowchart is the best way of doing it, but keep it very, very simple. Keep it very if-then, if you can. As I said before, make sure that if you are going to put in a assumption or a behavior, that you keep it top level. Now, a lot of people say don't put that in the flowchart, but I actually think that's very a good thing to put in mind, because you are putting in place your reasoning behind a decision. I actually think that's very good. One of the top things that people complain about is that there's a rule in place and it doesn't really make common sense, or they don't understand the rule. And so what happens in that case? Well, people go outside of the rule, they go outside of the process, and it's very difficult sometimes to know that somebody is going outside of your process unless you catch them doing it. And then you'll say to them, why on earth didn't you do this? We have a rule on this. And they go, well, it doesn't really make sense to me, I don't understand it. And it's difficult to punish them from there if you've not justified your reasons and just go, this is the rule, follow our rules. So I actually think in a process or a flowchart, it is useful to put in place your thinking. This is the reason behind that, especially if it's towards the end person. So, hey, we don't want to bother people. If they don't seem interested, don't send them a message. Most people will go, okay, that makes sense to me. Once you've got that process sort of mapped out on a piece of paper, difficult thing to do, takes a lot of time, but try and get that in the simplest form possible. Look for your processes to reduce as much as possible, not add on. When you've got it to the simplest form possible, that's possibly when you can start optimizing. What are you looking for? Obviously, you're looking to identify bottlenecks in your process. So that might be a case where somebody is the only point of contact for a particular decision that needs to be made. Might be, for example, you're selling something to somebody, you get a technical question back that you don't understand, and there's only one person that can answer that question, or there's only one central point for that question. That person is very busy normally. They're your subject matter expert, and so they become a bottleneck for you to go back quickly. And maybe the process is, okay, if somebody hasn't responded in a day, you instead say to them, hey, I don't know the answer to this question. Do you want to go on a call and my stakeholder can answer that? That might be the case. But try and identify those bottlenecks, and try and find a reasonable way around that. Often the problem in those sorts of situations is that that person needs a lot of information to give you a good answer back. So you need to know what sort of answers to questions do they need before they can give you some information. But it might also be a case that you just put in place, hey, it's okay to give somebody a vague answer, an answer that says, based on the information I've got, maybe this is the right answer, but I don't know fully. We're all guilty of giving a firm answer, I think, sometimes, instead of just saying, this is my educated guess. And most people are only looking for an educated guess, depending when you're talking to them. The next thing to look for is redundancies. So try and spot and eliminate redundant steps, activities that don't really make sense. Why are they in there? Try and reduce them as much as possible. It's amazing, actually, when you stop and think about these things, how many redundant steps are in there, often because that's the way that things were always done. I used to work in manufacturing, and there was definitely a culture where you don't change what works. But when you stop and think about things, there's often a lot of processes that don't really make sense, or they only attribute to old technologies or old ways of doing things, and with new technologies they're a little bit redundant. So change is difficult, but think about ways that you can spot redundancies and then get rid of them. And then last but not least, are there opportunities for automation? This is a little bit of a side subject, and I'm going to talk about this maybe in a future blog, but automating a load of LinkedIn messages is very, very dangerous, in my opinion. You should generally be sending a real message to a real person. One, you could get banned from LinkedIn for doing that. Two, you can send the wrong message to the wrong person. Three, necessarily, in making sure that you have the right lists of people, you can spend a lot of time doing that, so it doesn't really save you any time in the first place. But this is a separate subject. Look for opportunities for automation in your processes wherever possible. And when we think about automation, think about things like desktop automation, so robotic process automation. It's a bit of an older technology, but it can basically track your screen and everything you're doing on screen, replicate that, and then a human doesn't need to do that. It works on if-then situations, so you can automate a lot of things. It's very cool. There's a lot of use cases for it. I think at the moment, a lot of people are mixing RPA and data, which is really interesting. So the data does the hard crunching on churn signals and putting people in segments, for example, and then the RPA is used to maybe automate a message sequence or put people onto a certain list if that's not available through a different technology like reverse ETL, where the list can be made and a human can look at that thing and then send it. So there's lots of opportunities to automate when you start mixing all these different signals. What is the problem, though? When you've got a process, you've got it mapped out, people are following that process. Thinking about LinkedIn again as our example. So you create significant admin, like loads and loads and loads of admin in a space where you cannot automate your data capture. So in a world where you are not automating, I'm going to send this message to this many amount of people, and then I want to track that. If you've not got some way of tracking that, somebody needs to put in a spreadsheet like, did this many, this person did this message, this is message A and B. That creates significant admin. It's not part of the job, and it's not conflating to the core task. Yes, you can say it's part of process improvement, but it can take a load of time, and so it's not really helping you optimize. The first step I would recommend in that sort of situation is you first look at success. Can completely be wrong. So you look at what messaging was successful, what frequency was successful, who you were sending to, and that sequence, and you conflate your success to those things, which can blind you to the overall narrative. It's not always true, but if you can't find a nice, easy way of monitoring that, capturing that. That's the first place to start. But also look at what's an easy way of capturing that that's not too difficult for your sales team, for your process. So always look at what's the easiest way of monitoring these things, of capturing that data, so that then you can improve, which is what I'm going to come on to next week. I think let's have a 3-parter. So we're going to end on that cliffhanger. Jimmy is stuck down the well, and if you don't like and share this article, then Jimmy dies next week. That's the cliffhanger, guys. But next week we'll talk about data and how data matches up to processes and processes map up to behaviors. Thanks very much for watching. I've been Oliver Gwynne, and tune in next week. Otherwise, Jimmy gets stuck down the well and he dies.